Thank you, Millicent. And thank you all for coming. We're going to discuss the impact of the death of Osama bin Laden, and we're going to try to throw it forward a bit to think back possibly what 9/11 created for us. Iraq, Afghanistan, that we have to take our shoes off at the airport, democracy, and it gave us sat-nav from the Americans inventing new technology, and all those things that, because he commissioned that attack, have affected our lives. Now he's dead, or we're told he is, and we've got a panel of people that know very much about the area and how it's impacted on that we're going to discuss it with. At the end, Lynn O'Donnell, a former bureau chief for AFP in Kabul and recipient of the 2010 Human Rights Press Award for the coverage of the plight of Afghan women. Dr. Fazana Sheikh.
Oh, yes.
Right next to me. Associate Fellow of the Asia Programme at Chatham House and author of a book called Making Sense of Pakistan. My colleague Alma Ahmed Khan, head of the BBC Urdu service. Rosemary Hollis, in the middle, a professor of Middle East policy and director of the Olive Tree Programme at City University. And that's about conflict resolution, isn't it? And Israel.
Conflict studies. And
conflict studies, right. Conflict studies.
We don't claim to be able to solve them all.
And Zaki Shahab, Arab journalist, editor-in-chief of Arabs Today Net, which is the biggest Arabic language news website, and author of Iraq Ablaze. What I'm going to do is ask each of them to give us an upsum of what they think the impact is, and then we're going to try to divide it into a number of things: politics, religion, the Arab uprising, and a number of things for about 45 minutes, and then we will throw it open to questions, which I hope will evolve from the discussion. So perhaps if we start with you, Lynn.
No. Didn't expect that.
What is the impact of his death?
Okay. Vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden has been so closely associated with Afghanistan since 2001, of course. But the people that I've been speaking to in the last couple of days in Afghanistan, in Kandahar and Kabul specifically, have said that the overwhelming response amongst ordinary people is one of indifference. People have said, well, you know, Al-Qaeda is an idea, not a man. He didn't have much impact here anyway. It's the Taliban we're dealing with. And when you think about it, the Taliban commanders have never really looked at Osama bin Laden as their leader. There are probably only 200 or 300 Al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. They fight in isolation in areas maybe, you know, remote, close to the border. There have been reports that Al-Qaeda has been moving back across the border from Pakistan to set up camps, as the Americans have withdrawn to the area of Afghanistan where the main population centres are. They've been concentrating their efforts, but they're not really associated with the Taliban effort. And the Taliban have launched their spring offensive, and I don't think there's going to be any difference in their tactics. I think that's probably going to go on regardless. The other thing to think about is whether or not, though, the removal of Osama bin Laden paves the way for Al-Qaeda to possibly, for the Taliban to think about conforming with one of the main conditions that is laid down for entering into negotiations, talks about peace. And that condition is that the Taliban renounces loyalty and links to Al-Qaeda, and maybe with the removal of Osama bin Laden as a huge celebritized personality from the picture, they may be able to do that. So it could be a moving forward situation. But the other thing that struck me as the big winner out of all of this is President Karzai. who very quickly made his "I told you so" statement and said, pointed out that he's been saying for a very, very long time that the centre of global jihadism is not in Afghanistan, in the villages and amongst the poorest people in the world, it's in Pakistan. And not only was it in Pakistan, as he said all along, it was less than 50 miles from Islamabad, in a garrison town, the biggest house on the block. He can point very clearly at his own words from the past and at Islamabad and say, "I told you so." And from what I understand, the palace has already, the presidential palace has already got itself together with a quite a concerted PR campaign to put more pressure on the US, NATO allies to in turn put more pressure on Islamabad to get the rest of them, Quetta Shura, Mullah Omar, the other Al-Qaeda hierarchy.
Just to sum that up, so in your view, he wasn't even an inspiration, he wasn't a flickering candle, he wasn't a beacon in any way at all?
No, I don't think so. I don't think... no, I don't think so. Yeah.
Zaki, what?
Yeah, in fact, two issues of concern to us in the Middle East. One is the Arab-Israeli conflict and also the impact of Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. I do recall that bin Laden's final days in Kabul before he left, after the bombing started, was his word to the people around him, telling them, if you can make it from here, make it to Yemen. So that was final say to the group before they dispersed. And it seems, looking at what's happening now, how Al-Qaeda have flourished in Yemen, how strong they are, you can see what impact their rule would be, not only in Yemen, but also in neighboring countries, especially Saudi Arabia. The other issue is Palestine. I met Arafat month after 9/11, and definitely he was the beginning of, the United States was like cornering him, putting him under siege. And his words was exactly, if it wasn't for 9/11, we would be having a Palestinian state in 2 to 3 months. So, and now like to see Hamas and Fatah signing their agreement in Cairo today, 48 hours after bin Laden's death, is quite important, because Israel from day one, they have their own policy, or their PR campaign is for their diplomats worldwide. Whenever you've been asked about Arab Israel, just talk about terrorism and Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, because that's what the West want to hear. Now we are hoping that there's no bin Laden anymore, so the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestine would be back to the center stage.
So if he's neutral in Afghanistan, a negative impact in a lot of the Middle East, who are his followers now?
To be honest with you, most of his followers either from his native country, Yemen, or very, very few elements, either in Pakistan or maybe few Syrians or Palestinians or Jordanians. So we are not talking about large number. And as his role and his impact on the organization militarily and planning, bin Laden himself was not really a key issue on that front. It was Ayman al-Zawahiri. It seems from whatever investigation, whatever arrest has been made, whatever information has been passed, that he's not like the man behind all the planning for the many attacks took place worldwide. So practically, we can't talk about bin Laden have disappeared and Al-Qaeda is going to diminish. We are talking about followers who never met him, or they never been registered as member of Al-Qaeda, but they believe in the kind of like politics which he tried to, encourage people of like, look what kind of treatment we are receiving from the West. So it really all depends how the United States next step would be towards the people in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, towards Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about that, Rosemary, in a second, but Farzana, give us your view of how this is seen now in Pakistan.
Well, Humphrey, I must say that the last time I felt this way was when A.Q. Khan was revealed to be responsible for trading Pakistan's nuclear secrets.
You mean embarrassed?
Embarrassed, shocked, shamed, a whole host of very conflicting emotions. But perhaps that's just me. All I know is that I have lived this before, and I lived it then. I think what's interesting at a more general level is the way in which different levels in Pakistan have reacted to the death of Osama bin Laden. I think it's fair to say that ordinary people, a little like myself, are in a state of shock. People simply cannot quite believe, cannot quite come to terms that a man wanted in connection with the world's worst terrorist atrocity should have been just a few miles sitting comfortably north of the political capital in Islamabad, a few miles away from military general headquarters in Rawalpindi. I think a lot of people are having difficulty digesting this. Within the elected political government, there is clearly embarrassment, there is great consternation. They are clearly in a bind, because while I think it is true to say that the government would like Pakistan to be recognized for its role as a trusted ally in the so-called war on terror, as someone who has cooperated fully in intelligence sharing, they've had to be much more restrained about wanting to take credit for this operation. If indeed they could take credit, we don't know, because of course so intense is anti-American hostility in Pakistan that they must weigh their words, they must choose their words carefully so as not to be seen to be allying themselves too closely with a power, namely the United States, that is deeply resented in Pakistan.
In a nutshell, this is going through Pakistan. What will the impact be?
Well, I think the most immediate impact, to my mind, is that with the loss of Osama bin Laden, I think there is a real risk that Pakistan, its political leadership, its military and intelligence agencies have lost the leverage to which they had grown accustomed. Leverage that I think allowed them to develop a certain feeling of entitlement to Western, to ever larger Western aid packages, and certainly a feeling that they were entitled to a seat at the top table in Afghanistan, having had this golden goose, as it were, snitched from right under their noses. I think they are now in a much more vulnerable position and may not be able to exercise the kind of leverage that they had, as I said, grown used to, the leverage that comes with being a frontline state. But I'll pick up more on that.
Is what we heard there the view at the grassroots in Pakistan, or is it something slightly different there?
I think it's a tough ask. I know in this world of online journalism now, there's an increasing pressure on journalists to come up with bite-sized summaries of how a particular event may impact the world and all that sort of a thing. I think it's very difficult to come up with a bite-sized summary in this case. I'll give you an example. I sent out my reporters in 4 different cities in Pakistan the day after Osama bin Laden was killed. And I asked them not to ask anybody any questions, just to sit at bus stops and at roadside cafes and basically at the street level chat sites, wherever they could find one, and just to observe and to record what the people were talking about. And the report that they sent back from 4 different cities was that hardly anyone, this was hours after Osama bin Laden had been killed, that hardly anyone was talking about it. And what were they talking about? What they were talking about were 12 to 18 hours of power cuts every day, the state of the Pakistan economy, the state of the security situation in Pakistan. And the first jokes that came out after Osama bin Laden's death was announced was that Pakistan, oh my God, Pakistan has become so unsafe now that even Osama bin Laden is not safe there. So, but on the other side, for the first time in this last 10 years, Pakistan's security establishment, essentially represented by the ISI, has preferred denial to any accusations of going wrong on this war on terror or not being sincere to fighting this war. Denial has been their preferred response throughout these 10 years, without a single exception. This is the first time that we have seen the ISI calling informal briefing for a select group of journalists and telling them, please believe us, we have failed. Right? So this admission of failure is a kind of a desperate desire within Pakistan's security establishment that they're hoping that it sells to the rest of the world, because it is the only convenient way in which they can explain what went on right under their noses. Clearly, now there's a disconnect. At one level, there are the people who couldn't care less whether he was alive, he was dead, he was killed in Pakistan, outside of Pakistan. On the other hand, the entire Pakistani security establishment is coming up with one story after another, contradictory ones, running in different directions, really, trying to explain what has happened and how it shows them to the rest of the world. Now, why is that disconnect there? Now, if we are to understand the impact of Osama bin Laden's death, especially in the context of Pakistan, I think we have to really examine this disconnect. Why this disconnect is there? What is it that drives it? And what is it that is required to deal with it? And unless we examine it in its detail, which requires a very detailed examination of Pakistan's security analysis, which has made Pakistan do what it has done, not now, not today, but what it has been doing over the last 30 years, it'll be impossible for us to understand what impact Osama bin Laden's death may have on Pakistan.
Yes, Rosemary, I didn't mention that Rosemary is actually here with two hats, and I'm going to ask her now about the United States, because they're the polarizing other side of the bin Laden story that we've been hearing. And given, I mean, were they always chasing a sort of simple fantasy of an enemy, from what we've been hearing here? There's a neutrality about it here. Was it created, was he created as a myth in the United States, and his death is actually...
Part of what I have to say about where I think the United States sits in all of this has to do with how, straight after 9/11, they chose to declare a war on terror. And I was amongst those at the time who said, this isn't going to work. And you deal with a criminal act as a criminal act, not declaring war on an ism, a war without end. But strangely now, 10 years on, with his assassination, it seems to me a fitting act of war with the potential to end that war. And also, following the media response in the West to his death, I don't think you can separate him, the man and the figurehead of Al-Qaeda, from the publicity and the war of the narratives. And I asked myself a few questions. Is he dead? For the US, was it better to take him dead rather than alive? Was it legal? Has justice been done? Will his death lead to reprisals? And what are the US options now? And is he dead? Why bother asking that question? Because it was curious how on the Western media, including on the BBC, so many people were reporting in that they don't believe it. Again, that reminded me of 9/11. There was a kind of strange dichotomy in the reaction of Arabs. Like, they had it coming to them. The Americans had it coming to them. But it couldn't have been us. We couldn't have done anything that sophisticated, which was a very weird juxtaposition. And in this case, why would you ask? Why the reluctance to believe that he's dead? I personally believe he is dead. I don't think the Americans would have spun this story that far. And I can't see what purpose it would serve if they had. Was it better for the US to take him dead or alive? I think there's a slightly mealy-mouthed debate on the media about how it was improper to take him dead. I think from a US perspective, it was by far the most practical thing for them to do. The consequences of holding him for the duration of a trial, the potential for hostages to be taken, acts to be perpetrated in his name while he was alive, was much greater than the fear of reprisal. He would have been one hell of a handful, and it was not clear to me that they could have handled the kind of fallout from that over what would have been years, as well as just getting rid of him. And that's where I come back to an act of war. Why would you suddenly expect the United States in these circumstances, once they got him in their sights, to revert to legality and courts and putting the case against him? They have killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have died in the name of response to 9/11. So that suddenly at the end it would make some difference to people's perceptions, especially in Pakistan, of the United States, if they'd taken the man to court. It is beyond me. I don't think it would have made any difference. And was it legal? Probably not exactly.
Didn't Bill Clinton sign an order after the 98 bombings in Tanzania to have him, that he could be killed? I think that order went through. So therefore, technically, under US law, it would have been legal, unless it was rescinded.
Yes, but the debate is about if you make might right, how can you preach rule of law to others? But I don't think that's ever been the case, that the United States has conducted itself in accordance with the rule of law, or only insofar as they can argue that according to their law, maybe. But, you know, the invasion of Iraq, they didn't care whether it was legal or not. And just a couple of other points. I did, of course, it's absurd to say justice was done. And President Obama is a lawyer. And as soon as you mention the word justice, you conjure up images of the theological debate, the ethical debate, jurists debating it. Joe Public has a notion of what's justice, and politicians certainly have a notion of what's justice. So it's use of words. He spoke as a politician, not as a lawyer on that occasion. And will his death lead to reprisals? I think the United States needs to beware of triumphalism. They could increase the potential for reprisal if they humiliate in their enthusiasm. And yet, I think the threat, and I think the other panelists may have a better perspective on this than me, but I think the threat of Al-Qaeda has peaked, and the potency of Al-Qaeda has peaked. And Humphrey, you mentioned the Arab Spring. I really feel that it's, whatever appeal it had has been really overtaken by the appeal of the Arab Spring.
Well, I mean, that's what it's a double whammy in a way, isn't it? The death of bin Laden at the time that the Arab Spring's happening. I want to come to you on this, Zaki. I want to discuss for a few minutes the change and impact it might have on politics, not religion, on politics. Do you think that this would have what's going through my mind is a possibility that whether the Western approach to what happens in the Middle East now, forgetting the Israel thing, what happens with the Arab uprising, will change given that this figurehead of evil is now dead, or whether it'll be business as usual?
I think it's going to be business as usual for one certain important thing, that bin Laden never done anything which would like have its implication on the Arab-Israeli conflict. We never seen Al-Qaeda or himself planning an attack against the state of Israel. On the other hand, practically we lost as a result of his activities. So I don't think it will have any impact. We do hope that maybe it can be positive impact. As I mentioned, the United States for many years since 9/11 be saying this is our top priority, war on terror and all these things. Now, with what happened, we do hope that it's time that United States look at the serious issues which Al-Qaeda have used from day one, trying to like recruit people on the whole block. That's the double standard the United States want to implement. That's like, you know, the kind of ignoring UN resolution, because for the United States and the White House is like, what, you know, pick and choose. They just pick like whatever causes they found is convenient for Washington and its interest to say we want to implement United Nations resolution.
But it was the terror issue that kept, or was the motivation for keeping people, the Egyptian president, the Yemeni president, all these people.
This is a complete different situation now in the Arab world. We have to remember, all these people who've been removed, they were dictators. They were like forced the masses to accept agreements, either signed by by their capitals and the state of Israel, or because the Americans have like enforced, because of the aids being given to these capitals. Now the masses would have its word coming, and it depends how the United States would act in the future with the Arab masses. Because at the end of the day, if you have like opinion poll in Cairo about the agreement with the state of Israel, I don't think that any Egyptian will say yes for it. It was enforced in the people. The same thing. Change is still taking place. We have not finished yet. There is still Jordan. A lot of things going in there. Syria, it might take some time, but a change also might take there. So practically, the influence of a future Western policy and American policy in the Middle East would have an impact. If the Americans will really, you know, continue whatever they have been working for many decades, I think it's going to be a big loss for the Americans, because they will find the Arab world completely different than the Arab world they have used to see for many decades. At the end of the day, these capitals, either Washington or London and Paris, they've been supporting these dictators for decades. And to see them just going, and happy to see them going, I think the West has to be blamed for standing behind these dictators, for supporting them, for justifying their acts, even if it was against the will of the people. So to see the Arab Spring now coming, it means that the people will choose whoever want to rule them. And I'm sure the experience, you know, we have in Egypt would force whoever comes to rule Egypt again that they will not do what Mubarak have done.
It always takes a number of people to create a dictatorship, not just the West. Farzana, I just want to move that question over to here, because Musharraf and before that, I mean, this issue of terror, and particularly after 9/11, was the reason for propping up the dictatorship in Pakistan.
Of course.
Will that have gone away, or will there be another cause to keep a pro-Western military establishment going?
Well, you know, Pakistan is quite an unusual case, because I think while it shares...
It's the key case, though, isn't it?
It is a key case, yes. And I don't want to be seen to be labouring the question of exceptionalism. And therefore, I will start by saying that it certainly shares many of the similarities that Zaki has been talking about, in the sense of a country where we've also had a military dictator, Musharraf, who clearly capitalized on the fear of terrorism to keep his regime intact. But the case of Pakistan is quite different from many of the other Muslim countries. In fact, I have been often criticized, saying that Pakistan actually shares much less with the Muslim Middle East than it does with Israel. Pakistan's problem, and this is a problem that goes right into the heart of the state, is really the problem of the state's ambivalent attitude to Islam. And I think this ambivalence at the heart of the state has permeated Pakistan's politics. Islam and religion have been repeatedly used by successive regimes, whether they are military, whether they are politically elected, as a means of propping up regimes and giving them legitimacy. And what this has meant, to my mind, is that Pakistan has become, over the decades, much more vulnerable, much more environmentally friendly to different waves of so-called Islamism, from the very radical to the less radical. It is this uncertainty at the heart of Pakistan that I believe has left it so open and so vulnerable to these waves. And of course, this has been taken advantage of by our military regimes, which have been in power for more than half of Pakistan's history. Regimes that have actually nurtured a policy of militancy, used militant groups as so-called strategic assets to pursue Pakistan's regional interests against India and Afghanistan.
I want to come to you, Lynn, very quickly. This concept of the religion being used by the powerful, and then bin Laden obviously being used, is that in Afghanistan as well, or is Pakistan unique?
No, I don't think it's unique. I think that it's very cleverly and strategically used to greater or lesser degrees in various parts of the country by people who are called Taliban. But one of the issues in Afghanistan is, how do you define a Taliban? Is a Taliban somebody who is religiously motivated, fanatical, aligned with the Quetta Shura, for instance, or is it somebody who a poor farmer who's got 10 kids and a mother-in-law to support and half an acre on which he doesn't know whether to grow wheat or poppy? Or is it the mafia gangs that are exploiting that poverty and uncertainty to run a $3 billion a year opium and heroin business?
Zaki, just very quickly, is the situation we heard similar in the Middle East, that Islam is something that's used and it's not entrenched as much in the society?
It's not really like that. You know, when we talk about Islam, it's like conservative Islam. It's like a normal, traditional Islam, you know. It's like if you walk in the streets of Cairo, you just, you know, you can see couples going along, you know, with scarves and things, and just normal behavior. You would just laugh at, you know, a lady with a scarf and walking with a boyfriend or something. So it's more an idea. I'm sure there are some quarters that are like very serious Islam, where you find some kind of movement, you find some kind of activities. And I think this situation we are in, what you call the Arab Spring, you will see a lot of activities for you going for the Islamic Brotherhood and Islamist organization, in terms of how they are good at capitalizing about and benefit from the changes. In Egypt, you know, if you look at the present situation, you'll find the Islamic Brotherhood is the oldest and the most organized party in Egypt. And I'm sure if there will be an election in 6 months' time, they will have the majority and they will rule the country. Although they said we're not going to have more than half of members of parliament, which I think is enough for them to have the majority. Why?
Because I just want to stick to this point, because I want to move on to that later. I want to come to Amir and then Rosemary on this. Is this an opportunity for Pakistan to become a fully fledged democracy, given the two things that we heard here about AQ Khan and then bin Laden?
This question has been, I've come across this question being asked and debated in the Pakistani media also. But I think we need to look at this very relevant point about this ambivalent attitude towards Islam, which I think directly ties into Pakistan's chances of becoming a democratic country. I think this ambivalence is not specific, religion specific. It is not an ambivalence about Islam. If you recall, in the 1980s, Pakistani army, Pakistani military establishment designed a policy which they called a policy of deliberate ambiguity, which they maintained over their nuclear program, and ended up developing nuclear weapons in very hostile circumstances, when the rest of the world was very, very wary of what Pakistan was doing. And because the army as an organization is not really a very clever thing, so if they've succeeded with something once, they tend to carry on with it. And from what I see going on in Pakistan, is that they've just extended this policy of maintaining a deliberate ambiguity on their war on terror, on their policies on the war on terror, which they felt could help them play their games. Which is why the world today is asking, one of the biggest questions that the world is asking is that, did Pakistan know Osama bin Laden was there, or indeed was the Pakistan army protecting him?
Is it able to change?
That's what I was coming to. Compared to that, compared to all the intelligence games, because Pakistan is in essence a security state. So compared to all the intelligence games that it feels that it must play and which are in its interest to play, when it comes to politics, I think the army's attitude is quite clear. And that is that the only place where they don't want democracy is Pakistan. So I am personally quite cynical about this situation leading to anything that will result in a better or a stronger democracy in the country.
Rosemary, is the US, given that we have Obama in power and not George W. Bush, able to get away from this one-man enemy, one-man hero situation? I mean, we've had Saddam, we've had bin Laden, we've got Gaddafi now, as if just if you get rid of this one person, everything is going to be rosy. We had Benazir promoted again in Pakistan, as if she came to power, then it would suddenly become a democracy. What is the thinking over there of how you get over this simplistic element to actually go and do the hard work? Because it was it 2005 Condoleezza Rice came up and said we will stop supporting dictatorships, we will support the democratic aspirations of all people, and it seems that since then nothing happened at all. Is anything going to happen now?
I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but the Pashtun service of the BBC asked me, was this assassination timed by the Americans to boost the Democrats' electoral chances? I was astonished by the question. I said they got him in their sights, they couldn't possibly have let him go. So the idea that they would wait, calibrate this operation to boost his electoral chances, I don't buy. However, it's a wonderful fillip to the reputation of Obama. And it's a real comeback in the face of all this extremely nasty Republican far-right criticism of him. And I can see as a politician, therefore, to say justice has been done and so on, I would see it as a moment of a great opportunity for the United States to move beyond, to say, okay, we got him finally. And for the United States, they need, in a sense, to build him up as the significant person that they need him to be, to say, job done, finish, and now we can go home. So
you mean go home from Afghanistan?
Indeed.
But what about the all the other work that needs to be done? Whether it's interference, whether it's drawing back, the hard work of building transparent governance and...
I don't think ever that the United States could build democratic systems in other people's countries. I thought that was always a fantasy.
So you think it'll pull back from that now?
And I do accept that a lot of Americans joined up after 9/11 in order to go after the guys that hit them on 9/11. And that in American national interest, they couldn't let that rest. But I think they've become totally disillusioned with the idea that they do what Donald Rumsfeld, of course, said that they couldn't do, which is nation building. We don't do that.
Well, I just want to sort of, because Zach's point and the point that we've got over here is that it's precisely because they were propping up these dictators that the nations did not get built in North Africa or Pakistan or other parts of the world. So in that respect, they were doing something, weren't they? And what I'm trying to establish, do you think they will now pull back from doing that, or do you think they'll do the same thing but in a different way or with more awareness?
Well, they could never grant. One neocon said after 9/11, he said we had two options: either it was their fault or it was their either it was our fault or it was their fault. Well, we obviously weren't going to say it was our fault. So it was always going to have to be the fault of the terrorists, and hence the story thereafter told. But in fact, what Al-Qaeda stood for at the time of 9/11 was antipathy to what had been happening to Iraq for a decade, and to the presence of American forces on Arab soil, particularly in Arabia, and to injustice to Muslims and interference and the oppression of the Palestinians and so on. it was a litany of objections to interference in, quote unquote, our part of the world, the Arab Muslim part of the world, and they have to get out. Now the Americans responded by saying, we're not getting out, and in fact came in spades and went to war in spades, and thought, mistakenly I believe, that they could remake the whole area. That was the neocon project. And having failed, I think Obama came to power recognizing the limits of US power, but he had to do something like this to get out respectably in US terms.
I'd like to...
Can I just highlight something about Afghanistan?
You can certainly highlight it probably in the next question, Zaki.
Just according to what you just said.
Very quickly.
Yeah. You mentioned Afghanistan. I was personally in Afghanistan a few months ago, and I traveled to Helmand and Kandahar. I was embedded, and I thought at some stage, reading the papers here, watch TV, that there was some success have been made, some cities has been liberated. Honestly, I was extremely disappointed, because even the biggest achievement, the British government were talking about that we have, like, it's safe to go with Lakum Shah, whatever it is. It wasn't safe at all. You have to be in tanks walking. And if this is going to be the victory we are talking about, you know, it's very sad. You know, when you talk about recruiting soldiers or policemen in Afghanistan, do you know how the recruitment of policemen, how much time it takes? 3 weeks. Do you think someone who don't know how to write and read can be a policeman, you know, asking people to comply with laws, to be a policeman within 3 weeks? That's what we are doing. It's just large numbers, trying to recruit figures to make fit with the bill that we are going to withdraw from in 2014. I think it's very sad. Definitely the Americans are going to go. Corruption. Kabul is not safe anymore. I can tell you, Kabul 3-4 years ago was much safer than it is today.
Okay, I just want to move on a bit, because it touches a little bit on what you're doing. Islam. When bin Laden hit in 9/11, a big debate began about Islam. Where is it going? We've had here in London the homegrown Al-Qaeda affiliated bombers or inspired bombers in Madrid. There are these groups of young men and the various mosques around the place. What impact or how is the religion, do you think, going to change, has changed, will evolve? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can only really speak with any degree of certainty about Pakistan and Islam. But I think what I will say is that, you know, you can apply it more generally. I think we would all agree in this room that Islam comes in all shapes and sizes. It isn't a monolithic religion. It has many voices. And one of the problems in Pakistan, because of the fragility of its national identity, because of the fundamental uncertainties that underlie this identity, in Pakistan we have tended, on the whole, partly as a result, of course, of state sponsorship, to crush the diversity of Islam in the interests of promoting, if you will, a one and only one way to Islam, a one and only one way of being Muslim, which people, political leaders, the state, believed would help resolve the ambiguities and the tensions in Pakistan's own identity. And I think that's really the
hasn't worked?
And I don't believe it has worked, because in fact, as I said, Pakistan's national identity and indeed local varieties of Islam are extremely diverse.
So does it need to unravel for Pakistan to start? That single-minded view has to unravel.
Well, I think we need an understanding of citizenship and of Islam that is much more pluralistic than we have been willing to entertain until now.
Lynn, given that in your view the Afghans weren't the slightest bit interested in bin Laden, but at the same time he was this, for us certainly in the West, this sort of candle of extreme violent Islam that had thousands of followers. Is there a chance now? Is there? Would this be an opportunity, if that's the right word, or would it be a catalyst to make a rethinking of how Islam takes in the politics and the running of
Afghanistan?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure there's going to be that much impact. I think that it's probably fair to say that Osama bin Laden has been one of the greatest polarising forces between Muslims and non-Muslims generally, and maybe the removal of that, you know, the centrifugal force for people looking for an identity, to want to express their identity not nationally through their religion, the wearing of the burqa, you know, Islamic clothes, not just in Muslim countries or Arab countries, but here as well in amongst Islamic communities. So maybe the removal of him as the you know, I keep coming back to the celebrity head of a form of Islam will be a good thing generally. But I can't really say that, you know, Afghans, in my experience and knowledge, are their identity is as Muslims. It's just not an issue for them. They're pious, conservative, religious people generally.
I mean, what does that mean? Because if you were a bin Laden follower, your identity as a Muslim, all-encompassing, would have been to have followed. So what does it mean when people say that, and how might that now change?
I think we spend a lot of our time in talking about Osama bin Laden as an inspirational figure for militant Islam, and Al-Qaeda as an organization that carries out his agenda. I think what is ignored in this process is the social footprint that Osama bin Laden leaves behind, not only in terms of the increased radicalization in the society, but also in terms of the increased space for a way of thinking that is perhaps a bit more radical than it was before 9/11, a bit more rigid, a bit more extreme. And I'll give you one example of that. There's a professor friend of mine, a lawyer, who runs a law college in Lahore, and he once sat down in his class and he asked the students there, he said, okay, how do you define yourself? And he says that 99% of the students in that class said that they were Muslim Pakistanis. And he said that I can bet you, Ahmed, that if you go into any other country and ask people how they define themselves in terms of their nationality and religion, people would say that I'm a British Muslim, or I'm a Canadian Muslim, or I'm an American Muslim. The fact that a larger number of educated middle-class Pakistanis are now looking at themselves as Muslim first and Pakistanis later, I think it's a very complex sort of a change, and it's a very definite sort of a change, not something that will be unraveled easily. And it takes a lot more than the dismantling of an organization or the death of a person, no matter how inspirational, to reverse that.
Just as far as bringing good governance to Pakistan, as far as them not hiding any more bin Ladens or having any more AQ Khans and that sort of thing, is it a good thing or a bad thing, being a Muslim Pakistani as opposed to a Pakistani Muslim?
I think it's I don't know in terms of good or bad, but it does make the job of establishing good governance a bit more difficult, because it is something which is so obscure that it is easier to exploit for a government or for a military that has a specific agenda, that has an agenda driven more by its own security and survival concerns than driven by concerns for the welfare of the people.
Zaki, this concept comes from the West as a crusade. Is that something that how people identify what has been going on and what is, for example, happening in Libya now? How is that viewed when that word is used?
It's not really, you know, we can't call it like crusade. Just very few are using such terms.
Sarkozy and George W. Bush used it, but
it's I think more to do with interest than to do with like religion to start with. And it was very clear from day one how, like, you know, the British Prime Minister and the French President, they really dragged the American to get involved in this. And the kind of what has been released from at a very early stage was very clear that both governments who were heavily involved with Libya, suddenly turned out against Libya. I remember, when Sarkozy was elected president, I was in Tripoli, and I was extremely with very close members of Gaddafi's family. I assure you that they have celebrated the success of Sarkozy in the election as if he belongs to the Gaddafi family. Why is that? Because Sarkozy was the Minister of Interior in Paris, in France, and I think he was have a very close relationship with the Libyan head of security and internal. So they felt really very close. The same thing, till very recently, we have seen Saif al-Qaddafi being treated in London as a prince. All the doors opened, everyone want to entertain him, and suddenly to start talking about dictatorship, I think it's lack of ignorance on behind of the people who are running here. Okay, so one last thing here, to see the British Foreign Secretary, coming openly. Second day to see he coming with confidence that Gaddafi is in Venezuela, it was something we should be ashamed of. Even he didn't come out to say next day it was the wrong information have been given. This is really reflects how far we build our policies and our future. We really have to be very clear about these things.
I was only going to say that we must remember that some of the radicalization in Europe has to do with the experience of prejudice inside Europe. And that one of the ways that dictators were able to sustain themselves in North Africa had not only to do with their undertaking to cooperate against terrorism, but also to cooperate in controlling migration into Europe. And that's not going to go away. And I think when it's not sectarianism, when it's not religion, it's nationalism. It's differing definitions of nationalism, it's discrimination against minorities, and it's racism. So I don't think Osama bin Laden is totally responsible for all these sources of radicalization.
We want to open it up now to questions. Too many hands going up all at once. One here, and we'll see what sort of theme we go on, and then we might lump a couple together. I've got one over there, yeah?
2 points quickly. First of all, about interest. I would agree with you, although I would use the term perceived interest. People have very short memories. The propping up of dictators didn't start with 9/11. Remember the Soviet threat? Perhaps I'm the oldest person in this room, but I'm also a historian. We have to remember that when we talk about this part of the world. Secondly, Afghanistan. Many Afghan experts, and I would agree with the line that Lynn was taking, have pointed out that there was never any love lost between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and that Mullah Omar was trying to control bin Laden and thought he could. And bin Laden, they were made to promise that they wouldn't carry out anything from Afghan soil, and then they did it. Bin Laden was cleverer. And if the United States had given the Taliban a bit more time, there is the possibility that they would have given him up, and think of those billions that would have been saved. But that is our problem even today. If you listen to our Prime Minister, we're still conflating Al-Qaeda and Taliban and Hamas, because it suits our muddled purposes.
Okay, very good. Could you say there was a hand in the? I'll take the lady there, and then you. And if you could say who you are, if you're affiliated to something, and is it a question or it's a question? Lovely.
My name is Tessa, and I work for the Austrian News Magazine. Could you elaborate a little bit more? I know that maybe it's boring because we have heard a lot about it in the last days, but you said that you suspect maybe that the military knew where bin Laden was hiding in order to keep him as a golden goose. But if the military knew who in the military, how does this relate to the ISI? A little bit more, please.
Could you just deal with that?
I think within Pakistan, I think you'll find very, very few people who would be willing to buy this argument that the military didn't know. And perhaps you'll find many people agreeing with the claim that to some extent, it was deliberately keeping Osama safe from the Americans for as long as it could, because it served their interests in many ways. But I think this, one has to have a little bit of an understanding of this policy of deliberate ambiguity that I was talking about, that Pakistan seems to have extended to its attitude towards this war on terror. And a part of that policy is this supposed rogue element theory, where they say that, oh, there's this rogue element within the ISI that is doing something, and it has nothing to do with the mainstream military leadership, or it has nothing to do with the ISI high command and all that. I'm very cynical of this thing. I think if it was done, and if the military knew, it wasn't that some rogue elements within the ISI knew, and they were doing it without the knowledge of their superiors, or if it was the ISI alone that it was doing it without the knowledge of the Army High Command. If it happened, if indeed there's any truth in these claims that the Pakistan Army knew all along, or indeed may have even been sheltering Osama bin Laden, then it was a policy determined by the Pakistan Army, by its military high command, and it wasn't because of some rogue elements within the ISI.
So it was a policy? You think it might have been a policy?
It might have been a policy. It might have been a policy, but if it wasn't a policy set and implemented by a few rogue elements that the army had.
It was right from the top.
Right from the top.
Over there.
Hi, name is Pendar. I'm unfortunately at best affiliated with myself. During 9/11 attacks, Zardari only a couple of weeks ago, I think, mentioned that the damage to the Pakistani economy has been 80 billion US dollars set against $20 billion of aid. You have a situation where the Pakistani sovereignty is comprehensively compromised. Drone attacks happening all the time without authorization by the Pakistani government. You have a situation where US actually attacks the compound, and
is there a question, or
yeah? Sorry, this is not really a rant. It's just a kind of a context I was going to get to. But really, what I want to know is what will happen in Pakistan? Will it result in the people of Pakistan and the government of Pakistan resenting the US when it loses interest in Pakistan in the following few weeks?
Zana, quickly on that one.
Very quickly, I mean, it's not so much that the people of Pakistan will begin to resent the US. They already resent the US. They have resented the US for a long time. So this is nothing new. What we're seeing really is you know, those feelings having become much more intense. And yes, there is a great deal of anger on the part of ordinary Pakistanis over drone strikes, over what they regard as the systematic violation of their sovereignty. But at the same time, it has to be said that there are many in Pakistan who are left rather bewildered about whether or not these systematic violations of sovereignty are being resorted to with the tacit connivance, not just of our political government, but also with the tacit connivance of our military establishment.
And they can't vote the military out, can they?
And of course the military is strictly unaccountable.
A hand came up, that one, yes. Thank you.
I read in the papers today that America, they might cut off all aid to Pakistan. Is that possibly the best thing that could happen?
Nice question. And then if we could have a non-Pakistan question after that, but it is a good question. Both of you very quickly on it. Is it the best thing that could happen, yes or no?
There's a very strong sentiment in Pakistan that yes, let's try and do it for once without aid. But how to do it? Nobody's come up with a solution as yet.
Cuba did very well without aid. Zana, could Pakistan do the same?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't fall amongst those people who would argue that, you know, yes, as of tomorrow, suspend all aid to Pakistan. I think the effects of this would be catastrophic, and I've said as much in a recent comment piece that I wrote. Pakistan's economy is in desperate shape. We do need international support, but I think there has to be a better way in which this international support and this international assistance is actually transferred to Pakistan. Perhaps Pakistan and its governments will now be made much more accountable than they have in the past. That might be one way of doing it. The Kerry-Lugar bill did try to include clauses that called for greater accountability, but the force that resisted any attempt to make Pakistan more accountable was, of course, our military, and so we found that, you know, that came to nothing.
There's a gentleman there.
Yes, Dennis Marks, broadcaster, filmmaker. Non-Pakistan question. We still haven't received an answer to the question of what the significance after the death, if it is a death, of Osama bin Laden, to international terrorism and international jihadism will actually be. I'm one of those people who believed that Al-Qaeda was a bit like Starbucks or Goldman Sachs, that it was more like a franchise than a horizontal franchise rather than a vertical leadership. And if that is the case, and if the decapitation of the symbolic leader of this international jihadist value system has actually happened, then what does that actually mean in terms of the way in which people who believe in militant Islam as a way of achieving a different value system? What is that actually going to mean in the future?
Are there any more questions along those lines, and then we could sort of...
I think that's interesting. I've actually seen Al-Qaeda a lot as the IRA, and lately as Tony Soprano and the crime family. And I'm also curious, once the head, Tony Soprano, has been cut off, what happens underneath the surface? What kind of power struggle is going on for leadership? Is it al-Zawahiri, or is there a whole other generation of Tony Soprano nephews and sons who are now fighting for control?
Along the same lines, is it?
More or less on the story there.
Okay, we'll go to the fringes.
Yeah. Do you see any link between all these issues which we're kind of dealing now and the neoliberalism excess for the last 15 years in the world?
Can you say again?
Okay. Do you see any link between the extreme neoliberalism in the policy of US and the Eastern world and the issues which actually we're dealing with? If that policy was actually the bottom which created the problems which everyone tried to exploit.
Rosemary, can we go to you first on that? Is that how is this Sopranos organisation seen from Washington, and how might they now handle it? And then I want to go to Zaki to get at the...
Well, let's remember that the counter-terrorism phenomenon has become an industry, and whereas once upon a time watching the Soviets and conducting the Cold War was an industry with a lot of jobs at stake in the United States. Counterterrorism experts have proliferated, and there's horrible numbers of books explaining why terrorists do what they do and the role of Islam or the lack of role of Islam in all of that. And I think I would say that the causes of unrest, the anger at prejudice, as I was trying to indicate before, will not go away. Whether it is as useful as it was before...
they will be created, or that they'll be maintained by the counter-terrorism industry, rather...
There is a kind of symbiosis, a kind of action-reaction dynamic here. I think the United States, personally, played right into the hands of Al-Qaeda and blew it up by invading Iraq. I think they could have handled Afghanistan differently vis-a-vis the Taliban straight after the invasion. I find all the notions that they're doing a service to the people of those countries by going in after the terrorists, like we had with Iraq, as neo-imperialism. Actually, it's the same rhetoric as the British used in the 19th century when they said they were helping the rather backward natives to move on. So I think the counter-terrorism industry will be looking for the new game. I think the Arab Spring has caught them off guard and they haven't quite decided which side they're on. And I'm assuming that there's still some life left in the Al-Qaeda brand, but that it's peaked. But
So
it won't mean that terrorism disappears, and it doesn't mean that there aren't agendas for people who are living on the fringes in sub-Saharan Africa, spilling into North Africa, and that whether they call themselves, continue to call themselves Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb or whatever, or they invent a new name, I'm not sure, but the causes of grievance will not go away. And going to the neoliberal, it's interesting that you call it neoliberal, not neoconservative. Neoliberal suggests to me this business of the division of the spoils across the world, the distribution of resources. And I fear for the success of the Arab revolutions on economic grounds.
Zaki, who brands Al-Qaeda? Is it themselves or is it the West?
It's the West. I'm sure there is, as one of the gentlemen here mentioned, it's franchise. They do have supporters. They are not like linked for an organization. But looking at the changes taking place in the Middle East, you know, this would help the ones who've been like settled in the West for the last few decades, because they run away from the governments, they run away from jails. I think it's an opportunity for them to go back to their countries, either Egypt or Libya, or getting active in many parts of the Arab world. So
to do what? To carry on?
First, it's a good environment for them to go back. There will be less harsh measures. There will be more space for them to move around without being like, you know, followed or you know, arrested. Or so practically most of them, the ones who are really like at some stage they were like, you know, they are like wanted by their governments because of the connection, let's say regime in Egyptian or anywhere have contacts with the West. Now they don't fear. Now to see like, you know, thousands of people have left the jails in Egypt, you know, and look at about the stories, how they left. It's quite amazing to see. You know, most of them, they are wanted for security reasons or because of their affiliation with the Islamic organization. The same thing, you know, see what's happening in Syria. You know, these people, they are out now. They don't really have to live in hidden places in, like, you know, somewhere around London or in Parisian suburbs or Germany. So practically some of the pressure on these groups would be less because they start going back to their countries. The other thing, there might be very few elements who may be from Asian origins who would think, okay, we have to go back. But also on that front, you know, the whole you know, assumption of the Pakistani security that bin Laden is in the tribal area. You know, I've been to Peshawar, I've been to the tribal area, and all the briefing who you can get from Pakistani security intelligence is they are there, they are active. So to see things happening like, you know, around Islamabad or Karachi or Lahore, it's quite taking things away from the real target, who are the Americans. For the last 10 years, they've been concentrating all their efforts in trying to see what is in the mountain in that area.
Okay, so the Sopranos is dispersing, are they?
It is, at the moment it is.
They're not in, are they in Afghanistan, Lynn?
Yeah, I think there's a presence along
as big as they were in Iraq or in Yemen or anything like that?
No, I think that their presence is really quite small and quite isolated. I think there are probably training camps, and I do think that it is a corporatized style of franchise, and that there are links between the mothership and the smaller organisations, that they get the branding and the signs and the training and the arms, and they get the permission and they get the the leave to do what they do, no matter where it is. And I think that what will happen now is that there will be a retreat. They don't have the charismatic figurehead to replace. And as far as I understand it, it is a hierarchical organisation, so that automatically the number 2 will step up to be number 1. But they have to regroup. They have to decide where they fit in now that the charisma has gone. And I'm not even sure that we will see reprisals that can be traced back to Al-Qaeda within the near future, because I think that there will be a period of consolidation.
Okay. Let's have another topic of question. There's one at the back there.
Kavi, I come back to where we were earlier. Would the panel comment on the close ties between the House of Saud and Pakistan military and its consequences on the politics in Pakistan, where the non-Sunni Muslims have become a regular target of suicide bombings, and on the other side, where in Bahrain now there are reports of Pakistani former service personnel being fast-tracked to citizenship to change the demography of Bahrain, policy that they have copied from Israel in West Bank.
Okay, this is a Sunni Shia general question. So no, I know it's not. No. But I want to broaden it out a bit so that we can get anybody else that's interested in this topic, and then we can answer it generally.
I think somebody mentioned it earlier on, but I'm actually quite interested in panel's opinion as to who U.S. Body politic is going to select as a strategic bogeyman in the coming few months and years, apart from Gaddafi.
Any more interest in the Bahrain, Iran, Saudi, Sunni, Shia element there? Okay, let's. Where do we start with this one? Can you begin to tackle this one?
All right, a part of it at least about Pakistan Army's ties with the House of Saud. I can give you one recent example that there are lots of small religious organizations in the country which at times have been used by the army, so they continue to be supported by the army. The general perception of these organizations is that if the army or the military establishment withdraws their support from these organizations, they don't have much popular support, but they do have activists, and they do have the ability to kind of rally people around for short periods of time and all that. And all of a sudden, after the blue, after Egypt had happened, and after Libya had happened, and there was a lot of unrest across the Arab world, we saw a lot of these organizations springing into action and leading street protests, not against any particular Muslim dictatorship in the Arab world, but against those who were protesting against the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Now, it was a one of its kind protest, and it only attracted a few thousand people. But the people who had organized, the organizations who were involved in those demonstrations, were very clearly the ones that were allied with the Pakistan Army. So you can imagine the kind of concern that there is within the Pakistani military leadership of this sort of unrest growing in Saudi Arabia, that although they can't do much to stop it, but whatever little they can do, and no matter even if they have to do it in an embarrassingly transparent fashion, they will still do it. But where this demographic engineering inside the Arab world is concerned, I don't think I'm qualified to talk on that.
Rosemary, how's this going to pan out? Could you give us a scenario? I mean, it's been talked about a lot, what we're going, but it's also been the Saudis in Bahrain, the Saudis' relationship with Iran, the whole. Could you give us a sort of holistic idea of how that might pan out?
Well, I think that the invasion of Iraq unsettled the regional balance in a way that had a ripple effect that we haven't seen the end of yet. And I don't see the Americans having made up their mind whose side they're on in Bahrain. They're very susceptible to the argument that Iran would benefit if Shia Muslim Arabs benefit through changes in that region. But I think, given the experience of Iraq, they don't want to get down and dirty in sectarian rivalry because they know it's a minefield. And so fear of total chaos seems to be operative here. So you support dictators now because they're better than the alternative. And we're seeing that in terms of reluctance to interfere in Syria for fear of something worse. But that can only be a holding pattern until they've decided who the new bogey is. And scratching my head, I suppose it's China, because they're going to be such a rival on all the things that America has enjoyed unrivaled status on, having got rid of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union having got rid of itself. And it'll be interesting to see whether you can rail against climate change, but I suppose you can rail against ecologists.
Saki, two questions for you, both of them. The bogeyman, can you give us one name that you think will come up in the next year that will be the person we're all meant to hate?
It's really very difficult to predict. Let's say now everyone talking about al-Zawahiri taking over Al-Qaeda, but only the last few weeks, if you read the Islamic extreme literature in Egypt, we start hearing about figures who were like involved with al-Zawahiri when in his early days in Egypt, questioning his fatwas, his leadership. So I don't know how far al-Zawahiri as a figure will stay.
Okay, give us who's not going to be the name, but who is going to be the name, if you've got one.
It's really very difficult. It's very difficult.
Not Gaddafi.
Sorry?
Not Gaddafi.
Definitely not Gaddafi. No.
He's not big enough.
Not
He's
big
not
enough.
big enough.
Not big enough.
Or
So
it can't be
it
made
would be
big
somebody.
enough.
It would be somebody that is linked in a similar way to a sort of international terror.
It's really very difficult.
Okay. I just want to bring the question that came up here on the Sunni Shia thing and all this. Is there a way, you talked about the dictatorships that were on top, is there a way of getting rid of the dictatorship and moving towards democracy or peaceful transition without this unravelling in some way?
In Pakistan?
In Pakistan, well, generally, if you could broaden out your views, because in Pakistan, is there a way of doing it? Then I want to go across to Lynn and ask her the same question, because she's lived it in Afghanistan.
Right. So you want me to answer the question about democracy and not pick up where you were talking about sectarian tensions and Saudi Arabia? Because I just wanted to say...
If you have a point to say on that quickly,
I did actually want to say that about Saudi Arabia, if I may, that while the American presence in Pakistan, of course, looms large and is the most visible, Saudi Arabia has been the eminence grise in Pakistan. It is the real power behind the throne. It is the largest benefactor after the United States. And of course, its presence grew in the 1980s under precisely a military dictatorship, General Zia, who had very close links and brought the army, talking about those close connections between the army and the House of Saud, brought Pakistan's military much closer to Saudi Arabia, which, after all, do remember, was also the power that agreed to match dollar for dollar US assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 1980s. Pakistan was a conduit for all that assistance. So the ties, the nexus between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, Pakistan's military and Saudi Arabia, are extremely close. As far as Sunni Shia tensions are concerned, these of course are acute and have become even more acute in recent years in Pakistan. These too date back to the 1980s, when of course it was widely understood that Pakistan had become a playground for the proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both vying for regional dominance. So in many ways the tensions between Shias and Sunnis that you witness in Pakistan today are very much an extension of wider regional tensions. I'll leave it there.
We'll move on. I want to take some more questions.
Later.
We've got to wrap up. This is the last session of questions, so let's take it. Would you like my? There you go.
Okay. Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. I'd like to make a very general point that applies to all the conflicts that are going on at the present time and all the many conflicts that have taken place since 1945. Very simply, it is time that the human race learned to settle its difference without periodically slaughtering one another and without spending its valuable resources, wasting its valuable resources on providing the means to do so. And this applies, you talk about Bahrain and Syria and all that. Where did all the weapons come from? They came from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council whose fundamental remit under the United Nations Charter is to actually promote peace and security through the, throughout the world. And of course, all of these conflicts have taken place. Those 5 members, permanent members, have been either directly or indirectly involved or supplying the weapons for them. And we really need a complete change in our own foreign policy and having a better influence throughout the world. And then we don't need to have the sort of discussion we've been having here tonight.
Okay. So you're going to vote for AV tomorrow, are you?
It's much more fundamental than AV or first past the post.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Samir Mahmood and I practice as a barrister in London. My question was to do with the US's consistent policy of backing dictators, particularly in Pakistan and also the rest of the developing world, and the fact that both Bin Laden and Saddam Hussein were in fact working very closely with the US. Are there any lessons for the US to learn, or is the more cynical view that things have gone according to plan and provided a convenient pretext by which to then get rid of these so-called undesirable characters and invading Iraq and now invading Pakistan space?
Okay, let's have just one more question.
Somebody brought up the issue of Palestine earlier, and Rosebery, I think. And it seems as if no one takes into account that Osama bin Laden, certainly among he heightened, I think I would want to say, he heightened the contradictions between US imperialism, the whole issue of empire, and its opponents. And he contributed to building up the opposition to imperialism. And so he's always considered a terrorist. And the United States and its cabinet are getting applauded for killing this terrorist in cold blood who's unarmed. And I just want to raise how the tenor of the conversation has gone, that we just assume that there are dictators who are nasty and must be dealt with in a compromising way, one way or another, and then there are people like Osama bin Laden, who are people are indifferent to. The first you said, when he certainly highlighted the problems, the international problems that many people, and I'm thinking maybe of people like Mao Zedong, had tried to deal with, Fidel, for example, much earlier. And if there's a war on terror, surely Israel has to be held responsible for terrorizing the Palestinians, especially in Gaza.
Okay.
And the whole issue of language here seems to be inverted, that the terrorists are those
who are opposing imperialism, and the good guys are those who are the imperialists.
Okay, thank you for that. That's some. What I'd like to do is pick up on the points there. It is this issue, isn't it, of the dictatorship that's your guy and he turns bad and he has these oppressive people, and how do you move from that to good governance and a stable, secure society? It's a big issue, but I'd just like a couple of seconds from each of you, because you've lived through all this, of how best it should be done. Now, if Bin Laden highlighted it, as we heard over there, how do we now get rid of this problem forever so that we can have stable, good-governed societies? Lynn?
Well, I think the foreign military presence in Afghanistan is the most destabilising force in the country. But I fear that it's gone on for so long and destabilised the country to such an extent that withdrawal will just result in an even worse situation.
And if the Taliban had been allowed to continue?
Well,
if Bin Laden hadn't happened, would it be a better place, or would it be a dreadful place? Or?
Well, I think one of the great fears that very many Afghan people have is that the foreigners pull out and the Taliban come back, because unlike very many people in the world, they know what is coming. They've been there before and they didn't like it, and a lot of them don't want it back.
Zaki, really quickly. How do you get rid of the dictators?
You can't teach people good or governments or good governance if you don't set yourself the example. So look about Iraq today. It's the number 8 corrupted country in the world. Afghanistan.
That's how not to do it. How do you do it?
Sorry?
You're just giving us an example of what not to do. Can you give an example of what to do?
What to do is we have to be a good example. If I'm going to influence countries and teach people how to practice democracy, I have to be a good example, not to encourage them to do that and then later on accuse them of being corrupt and so on. So
stop killing them.
Rosemary,
at least.
I've changed over the years, and I no longer am as surprised as I used to be by the hypocrisy. I've come to assume it, and I've also come to the view that we do more harm than good when we try to help, and that therefore I'm afraid we just have to stay home.
Stay home. Let it evolve naturally. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, leave the Libyans to do their own thing. It may be bloody and nasty, but us going in is always bloody and nasty.
Ahmed?
I think in the immediate, in the very short run, stop speculating whether the Pakistan army knew Osama bin Laden was there and whether it was protecting it or not. Just hold it responsible for the fact that it was found in one of its military garrisons, and therefore stop dealing with the Pakistan army, deal with the elected government.
Well, I would want to certainly reinforce that, but I do want to say that for me, the death of Osama bin Laden gives Pakistan the opportunity to get serious about a real national strategy to tackle militancy, a strategy not dictated by the security state, a strategy not dictated by the interests of Pakistan's military, but by its people, through, of course, its elected government. We need a national consensus now. We need to get serious about a national strategy to tackle militancy. That, for me, is the need of the moment. And I think we have an opportunity now. I mean, Pakistan's military has got egg on its face. This is the time for the political government to seize the initiative.
That's it. Thank you. If it's really quick.
It's quick.
Okay.
Sorry to oversimplify. I'd just like to know from the panel whether it is or isn't safer, whether we are or aren't safer without Osama.
Okay, let's have a yes or no. Lynn?
I think it makes no difference.
Zaki?
I think we'll be safer.
Rosemary?
If the opportunity is seized.
No difference.
I don't think it's going to make much of a difference either.
Well, that was wonderfully succinct. Thank you. Brilliant panel. Thank you very much.